And we ended up moving from this messy operating model to a very straightforward operating model that we had 3 different segments: strategy, enablement, and execution. Because we knew we were going to need to have a place to be like agile in the system. We don't just want to put things out there. We want to understand, what are we putting out there? How are we measuring it? How is it performing? Are we getting, what we expected out of it? And be able to look at that across the entire suite of solutions that we may have.
So you're very welcome to another episode of Hiring Excellence. I'm Johnny Campbell, your host for today's show and CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. We're going to be talking today about TA transformation at PepsiCo. And our guest today is Blair Bennett. Blair is the Senior Vice President of Global Talent Acquisition at PepsiCo. And PepsiCo have gone through a really interesting transformation over the last number of years. And Blair has taken what I think is quite a unique approach, an approach we haven't heard on the podcast, to how she frames how a modern enterprise TA organization should look and operate. And she'll walk us through the details of how that was set up, some of the logic behind that, and where she's going in the future with that and her fantastic team. Blair, you're very welcome. You might just introduce yourself to our audience and maybe, first of all, tell us where you're joining us from.
Sure. Thank you, Johnny. It's great to be here and appreciate the opportunity to share PepsiCo's work. I am based out of our global headquarters in Purchase, New York, and I've been with PepsiCo 6 years, just over 6 years now. I actually, prior to this, was with Walmart for 7 years and Korn Ferry, the executive search firm, for 7 years before that. And I had a first career in politics, actually. So I am somebody who's had a 2-career track life, but I feel very lucky to be with some wonderful brands that I have been with, now having been in talent acquisition for about 20 years. And also did some stints. I was at HRBP at one point in time. I did an innovation project with Walmart. So really trying to do some critical experiences, which I think have helped to make me hopefully a well-rounded leader and somebody who's kind of used to change and transformation.
I love that. You're our second former political professional on the show the last couple of months. We had Anish Raman from LinkedIn, who was a staff writer for the Obama administration several years ago.
Yes,
Which
Anish and I have prepared stories.
He's fantastic background. I love that. We could do a whole separate podcast of life before TA, of what we all did before TA. Blair, I think everyone on the show is going to know Pepsi as a brand, but PepsiCo is more than Pepsi.
Yep.
Maybe would you mind explaining a little bit about the brands and maybe give us some idea of size, scale, and focus on hiring and what kind of roles an organization like that ends up having to hire for and that your team are responsible for?
Yeah, thank you. Most of the time when I'm explaining this, people are like, "Oh, I didn't realize that." But PepsiCo is over a $90 billion company, and we're in over 60 countries. We have an employee base of 300,000. And to give you a sense of kind of the dynamic of that employee base, we have about 230,000 of our employees are in the front line. So they are our superstars who are making, moving, and selling our products. And when you think about our brand portfolio, it's quite diverse. We have everything from, our core Pepsi beverage products to snacks, our Frito-Lay products. We also have had some very lovely recent acquisitions of Poppi, the prebiotic soda brands. We also acquired Siete, which is a lovely brand that expands us into positive choices. We Sabra Hummus is a brand. So when you really think about going down your snack aisle, you see us Lay's, Cheetos, Doritos. We now have a Doritos Simply Naked brand that's coming out, which is no dyes or artificials. So we have quite a range, over 30 billion-dollar brands, and then we have a lot of smaller brands that are in our portfolio as well. But we really, I think, are consumed over, a billion times a day by, people. Like, we're huge. And I think how we show up in other countries also under different brands. Like in LATAM, we have Gamisa cookies. In some countries, we have some dairy. So in South Africa, we have bakeries. So we really are diverse. From a recruiting standpoint, we my team recruits everything from, early talent and our campus recruits to our frontline associates, professional, as well as executive. So one of the things with our transformation is we centralized all hiring under our global talent acquisition organization. And in global talent acquisition, we actually have a very strong service delivery team who sits within our strategy and transformation team. So my team and that team partner as one team, but we are two different organizations. And PepsiCo is, as a company, we actually have a EMEA foods business, a LATAM foods business, an APAC foods business, an international beverages business. We have our global enabling functions. And so when we're recruiting for, the business, like sales, supply chain, marketing, those types of commercial roles. And then we also are recruiting for technologists and AI professionals who are part of strategy and transformation. We have food scientists. We have agro specialists. So the range of the types of profiles that we recruit is quite diverse. And actually, from a talent acquisition standpoint, we have what we call our talent acquisition winning aspiration, which is fueling growth and transformation for PepsiCo one hire at a time. So we stay very connected to what's the vision of the company and how do we really bring our hires to make that vision a reality.
So on the show before, we've had a few folks in the kind of food or CPG world. We've had Michael Lake from Ferrero talk about how people don't understand that they also make Tic Tacs and they now make cornflakes in North America. And these other brands, not just this Ferrero Rocher chocolate that people associate with them, are Guy Neves from Nestle, who's been on talk about the Nestle brands and had a different in different countries as well. One thing that's often those companies in I guess your world have in common, what I find, is they very regularly have decentralized TA teams.
Mhm.
That seems to have been a hallmark. Perhaps it comes from the history of acquisitions of brands and organizations, and they just didn't integrate the HR teams. And that's how it used to be in PepsiCo, is my understanding. You had a decentralized TA org, maybe some COE stuff in there. And you've gone through, as I mentioned at the top of the show, a massive transformation recently. Can you maybe walk us through the roots of the TA transformation, maybe how that found itself as part of the wider HR or digital transformation in PepsiCo? When did it start? Why? And some context as to what were you moving from before we go into what you moved to.
Yeah, no, as I mentioned, I've been here 6 years, and I will say throughout the last 6 years in talent acquisition, we've had transformation as kind of a theme. And part of that is when I first came in, we were moving into, as a company, more of the, sort of shared service model. And that also meant that within HR, we wanted to be able to leverage our global capability centers and some of, more standardization of processes and things that could really help us as a company, gain sort of efficiencies in our processes and, find more value in how we work without duplication, et cetera. And so when I first came in, it was kind of about putting work in the right places. But then in 2024, after, a few years of going through that transformation, I felt like we were sort of at the end of our roadmap. And
Aaron,
so it was a really good time to take a step back and say, what did we get right? What pain points still exist? And obviously, the world continues to evolve. So what additional, sort of evolution can we undergo? And at the same time, we had a new CHRO, or what we call Chief People Officer, come in. And she very much was encouraging our function to continue to modernize. And, PepsiCo is known as a HR Academy company. So we typically are leading, but we want to stay leading. So how do we continue to evolve? And she did ask the talent acquisition function to kind of go first in this next iteration of transformation. And where we were was we were still fragmented. So we had TA people who in the markets were recruiting to HR. We had some talent acquisition teams that were combined with talent management within local markets. We had regional teams who were kind of bridging between global and local. And what we realized when we really took a step back and said, hey, we want to update our operating model, we started to draw this out, and it was quite messy. and we saw that there was a lot of the same work happening at the global level, the regional level, and the local level. And so we wanted to simplify our operating model. The other thing that we were realizing is because of the messiness of how the operating model was at the time, although we had done a lot of really great work in standardizing processes, simplifying our tech stack, having more creative kind of strategic views, it was really hard to get the adoption we wanted. And it was really hard to get the strategies through this fragmented system. And so, the other thing was like, we knew that there were a lot of talent acquisition folks sitting out in local markets, and they weren't tied to like a broader organization. So even from a career pathing or capability building, that also was very difficult. So what we ended up moving to, and this took us several months to really like kind of peel back and assess, and then start to think about what we wanted to build as we move forward. And we ended up moving from this messy operating model to a very straightforward operating model that we had 3 different segments: strategy, enablement, and execution. And that way we could really look at what work will sit in each of those buckets. How do we have an interaction model that would have appropriate handoffs of work? And then how do we have a sort of flywheel that makes sure that the strategy can move through the system and really bring strength to the execution? And so that was kind of our simplified model. And then we needed to like rebuild our structure underneath that. So at the time, we really like just took a blank sheet and started to build the organization that we wanted. And we ended up moving our frontline and professional hiring outside of the US into our service delivery teams. And then we had a global process team that we brought together and centralized. And then we have our COE team, which we really built some new capabilities within there. And I can go into those in deeper detail, but really having that as a core strategy team. And then we have an attraction and engagement team that we also centralized through this work. And what that allowed us to do is look at our employer brand all the way through like local recruitment marketing. And you can go top of funnel to bottom of funnel. In executive, we brought in all director and above recruiting into this centralized team, because we know that when we look at our executive population, your processes may be a little bit more white glove. You want to start building the bench for, your senior executive talent. And so how you source that talent, engage with that talent can be different. Our early talent team, we also have brought together under one team, and that has allowed us to understand some of the pain points that exist there, which I don't want to get into all the details, but we found that we had over 80 early talent programs happening around the globe.
Wow.
That obviously is not necessary. So we created in this org structure the ability for us to be more specialized, and the ability for us to work more top of funnel to bottom of funnel, and the ability for us to look at more horizon 2, horizon 3 strategically, be able to enable that through tools, processes, and then be able to deliver those solutions to the recruiting and delivery teams so that that could come into play. And the one other thing that I will say is, up until we made these changes, our frontline staffing teams in the US were actually sitting within the business. So we brought those into the global talent acquisition function, and we decided between early talent and frontline that we would use those two like specialized pillars for additional transformation beyond the big organizational one that I just described. So maybe I'll pause there because I know I threw a lot out there, and we can dissect
You,
as however
you, you,
you, Johnny.
you teed up about 8 separate episodes I could dig into, Blair, if I'm being honest with you, right? But I want to hone in on maybe some of the very unique ones. And just first to mention, I know that from what I hear and see about you, you're quite a visual person. I believe, although you touched on it, that it wasn't until you literally got the whiteboard out and drew out the old process it became super evident to everyone that it was a mess, and not a mess, but just not functional and
It
not
was
the
a
right way to
mess.
do it. Oh, and often that's the way to do it, right? And you then kind of drew a more beautiful structure to get there. Just a couple of things just to help me, because I'm quite visual and numbers work in my brain. So walk me through those three buckets are really important. I want to come back to the strategy, enablement, execution buckets for a sec, but walk me through, roughly speaking, and you took a total number of folks who work in TA now in the new org. How many in strategy? How many enablement? How many execution? Just to get an idea of the size and spread between those three teams before we dig into them.
Yeah, so we have just under 500 people within our recruiting organization. Now, a majority of those recruiters are sitting within our service delivery team because they are our specialists, right, in frontline recruiting and professional recruiting. So within that organization, that's a majority. Within my organization, which sits the COE, attraction and engagement, early talent, and executive, there's just over 100. So there's about little over 400 and about 100. That's how we break it up. Now, our process team also sits within service delivery. Our process team supports everything from hire to onboard processes. And in that team, there's under 20 people who support onboarding and hiring. And then in our COE, we have about 25 people. Our attraction and engagement team is under 15. And so that kind of, we put our COE and attraction engagement kind of in that strategy pillar. The process pillar is its own, and then execution involves everything: early talent, professional, frontline, executive. But we have those broken out as specialty areas.
I want to make an observation and maybe dig in on this. That I think one of the most unique parts of the way you structured this is you have the strategy team. When I talk to leaders in similar roles, Blair, and you do the same, enablement and execution, that's a kind of what I would call standard pattern, right? We had Rohit Joshi from Sanofi on the show recently talking about how he brought it in from an RPO for Sanofi and set it up. And largely there was execution teams broken into different pillars, as you might say, executive, professional, frontline, etc. And then you have enablement, the ops tools, processes piece. Strategy doesn't get mentioned. Strategy is almost like, well, the boss does strategy and, isn't a dedicated team. And why I think it's so important and unique is it also ties in, I believe, to the second thing you mentioned earlier. One of the things you mentioned earlier, which is Horizon 2, Horizon 3 thinking, which is this not operational, how do we deliver today only view, but very much this, what will it look like in the future? What's happening in our business, in our macro environment? How do we set ourselves up so we can move fast to that change? And whether your organization is going through a transformation like PepsiCo has been through or going through, or it's just a leader looking at how AI might affect her or his TA team. I think we all have to be thinking about not just the now, but the future execution and being ready for possibly unknown permutations of what might happen. I think you've set it up really well for that. That's why I'd love to dig into the connection between the strategy team. And if you wouldn't mind, for any of our audience who's not familiar with the McKinsey kind of Horizon 1, 2, 3 thinking, could you maybe start there and then explain how that's influenced the strategy team, what the strategy team does, how it's separated from enablement and execution? But I think it's quite unique and certainly something that a lot of our audience won't be familiar with.
Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate spending some time on this, Johnny, because I do think it's one of a very special part of our organization, and one I feel like is going to make a huge difference. And when we say like Horizon 2, Horizon 3, it is definitely thinking about what is sort of um call it 3 to 5 years out, right? And how do we start to anticipate what we may be needing to be able to deliver beyond just what the asks of today are? And we really use kind of our company's 2030 vision to be a driver for that, so that we can constantly be looking at, all right, what's the business trying to achieve, and then how are we going to have to bring talent in that can help them help the company achieve that. And so what we've done, and bear with me because I'll take you through the different capabilities we put within our strategy COE, and then I'll start to describe how they all kind of work together. But within the strategy COE, we have a group of strategy leads who are aligned to our company's operating units, or those regions that I described. Then we have program designers. Then we have a team that is portfolio management and talent intelligence. And we also have a person who does our talent acquisition capability and engagement. And then we just this year added another capability to our COE, which is more enterprise thinking, but what we're calling talent foresights.
Hmm.
And so if I break each of those teams down, so our strategy leads are really and we have 4 of them. So it's a small team, but each one of those strategy leads is really responsible for understanding what is our global vision as a company? How does that start to translate into potential solutions that we need to build to help our recruiters attract talent? How does the global strategy connect to more regional strategies? And then how do we connect these different components to be able to deliver solutions from a global to local type of thinking? And then how they work is they partner with our program designers, who really are the individuals responsible for helping to work to co-design and develop solutions that can help us meet the needs of the future. And they use things like design thinking to be able to do that. They are a team of, sort of collaborators and creators with different tools that they can pull out of their toolbox to get to the right place. As I mentioned, design thinking being one of those. And then the third team is our portfolio management and talent intelligence. And talent intelligence is really, and again, this is, a team of 5 people. So, pretty lean, but really being able to look and look outside externally at what are the signals, and how can we use those signals to be able to help us move again into this longer term thinking. And then the portfolio management piece of that is actually really interesting in the concept, because when we are looking at a global talent acquisition portfolio of solutions, we don't just want to put things out there. We want to understand, what are we putting out there? How are we measuring it? How is it performing? Are we getting, what we expected out of it? And be able to look at that across the entire suite of solutions that we may have. And so that there's, an individual who works on that component, and we're still sort of in build mode there. So we're not totally designed in what that capability can deliver. But I think that that's going to be really interesting as you start to look at, it's a great way, right, to be able to showcase the effectiveness of your programs, but also when you have to go and, ask for investment, potentially, in AOP processes, to be able to say, like, here's why we're doing this. Here's what we're expecting it to deliver. Here's going to be the cost of it. And here's the return that we're going to be able to give you on this. So that's an important component. And then the recruitment, development and engagement is really intentional, because when we start to bring, new strategies into play, or new tools, or these things, we also need to continue to upskill our organization, or we need to continue to understand, where are we really excellent in delivery, or where might we want to enhance some of our skill building. And so this individual helps us look across, like, where are we today in our proficiencies, where do we need to go, and how do we do that work. And then engagement, of course, is important. We are all over the globe. We have, a significant team, and we want to make sure that people feel like they're connected and part of it. So things like every year, at PepsiCo, we have an org health survey.
Mm.
So, our engagement teams are helping us to say, like, okay, here's the priorities, from what we heard from our associates. Here's the things that we're going to put into place. And then here's how we connect the teams around that. And we also do, like, pulse surveys, where we're measuring the sentiment of our teams throughout the year. And how all these things work together, is we actually have created what we call our talent acquisition value chain. And so within that, it's like, let's start with the business problem. Let's do the appropriate research. So we do a lot of in-depth research, using both internal research and data and external research and data. So we may go benchmark, 30 other companies and what they're doing and how they're doing it and what that might look like. And then we start to look at, okay, do we already have solutions within our portfolio that can help solve these business challenges, or do we need to develop something new? If we need to develop something new, the program designers do it. Then they have the requirements. Then the requirements go to the enablement team. And then the, recruiters are getting that, as it comes through this value chain. And then they get the appropriate, like, training with it. And we also, I'll say one other thing, when we're, like, creating and developing solutions, we have this co-design methodology, so that our recruiters actually become part of the design also. And I can give you an example. We brought in an interview companion AI tool, and we had, 6 different recruiting teams who were helping to co-design that from all parts of the world, so that we were building it for the recruiters, and not, from the center and then passing it down. So
I love that. I was,
yeah.
I was, I was going to be John Vasilika and ask you a tell me about a time behavioral interview question with regard to that, but and that might be the good example, that kind of co-pilot for interviews. But I'd love to get an example from how something starts perhaps with the strategy team, how it ends up being kind of then brought into the enablement team, and how it ends up then in execution. Is maybe that example, or a different example, where you can say, hey, this is an initiative that started with strategy, ended up being a thing we then asked enablement to build processes around, build capability around, and ends up being something that in execution delivers every day. Do you have an example that comes to mind for
Yeah,
that?
let me use Interview Companion. We actually started this before we went into the new operating model, but
One.
it's a good example of how we want it to work. So we actually didn't start with the tool. Like, we don't start with a tool,
Mm.
because what we want to be able to do is actually say, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And in this particular case, what we were trying to create was a global interview framework. And the reason we wanted to create a global interview framework is because we were recognizing within our processes that there was a lot of sort of discrepancy in how the interview process was being executed.
Mm.
And so when we looked at it, we said, first of all, it's like taking too long. There's too many people involved in the process. We're not really, like, actually adopting the standard process that we put in place on the tools, the technology, the ATS. And so there were a whole bunch of things. And so what we actually started to look at is, if if our recruiters had a better upfront process, then that would give the hiring managers a higher sense of confidence in what information is coming to them and how the evaluation was happening. And then they're going to feel less inclined to need to have more people involved kind of at that point in the process. And so the whole thing starts to like build better understanding of the business, better trust of the recruiting team, better candidate experience, and ultimately a faster process and a more engaged process. So when we started to look at what we wanted to try to achieve, then we said to the enablement team, like, hey, this is what we're trying to achieve. We went out, we looked at different interview companion tools that we thought could enhance the recruiters' engagement with the candidates up front. And we brought that into the system. We co-designed with recruiters, as I mentioned, and then we developed the design of the tool, and then we deployed the tool to kind of this user group. But then when we did the soft launch with our entire recruiting team, what we did was we brought into the system and we were like, hey, we're going to give you this tool. Here's the training for this tool. What we want is for the first few months, just use it on a couple recs, no pressure, just get used to it. And then by a certain point in time, we want to be at 100% adoption.
Mm.
And that way, you're letting people kind of get comfortable with this. And we also want to encourage feedback loops so that we can continue to make the tool even better. So that's one example. I would say another thing that we haven't got all the way through the value chain, but to give you kind of this Horizon 2, Horizon 3 example is, as a company, our CEO is looking at, 2030. And, we started this conversation talking about our products and our portfolio, but like innovation is really important. And in the food and beverage space, there's a lot of innovation happening. I mean, think of all the flavors you're seeing and positive choices and, sort of fun choices and, different nutritional prebiotics and proteins and all these things are happening. Well, that's all innovation. And so as a company, we want to have a culture of innovation. And so our CEO has been talking a lot about this. And what starts to happen, of course, is your CEO starts to say things. Then all of a sudden, everybody's coming to your TA team saying, well, I need somebody who's innovative. And then the next, it's like, well, what does that mean? Well, like innovative. And so we were starting to get these messages. We were seeing the 2030 vision. And so we said, look, why don't we start to do a piece of research so that we can start to develop how we want to talk about this type of talent with our hiring managers. And we can also understand what are some of the profiles, how do other companies think about this type of talent? What are the motivators of this type of talent? Where might these types of talent show up? And so that piece of research is now starting to move into a phase where we are looking at like, what might our interview process look like as far as the types of questions you might ask? Or what might our recruitment strategy meeting at the very front, what might we want to ask some of the hiring managers who are in spaces where innovation shows up? Like, what are we talking about? And our recruiters will have a much better sense of like the types of questions, the language to use, the, understanding of where talent might be available, the types of, talent motivators that could attract them to PepsiCo. And so we'll start to build these types of tools to put in the hands of our recruiters so that they can have these richer conversations with both candidates and hiring managers, making the process more seamless, faster, et cetera. So those are two examples that we're sort of working through.
I imagine, Blair, somewhere in the back of your mind, or the fore of your mind, you're also thinking about this separation allows you to, I think, future-proof in that execution is probably where most of us think there's going to be a lot of innovation and maybe change in terms of how we deliver hiring.
Yep.
And there's the big talk about how we're going to remove the administrative parts of it, upskill the function, deliver a better product to the business, to hiring managers, etc.
Yep.
And I think what most folks forget is that you need a good backbone to deliver that. So when you have a strong strategy team who are acting, the way I hear it, Blair, more like product managers in a tech company, your customer listening, your design thinking, you're walking through who's our user persona, what are the journey for that person, how do we basically build for that functional thing, then we'll go build or find a product for that. Then you go and say, how do we actually build it? Maybe that's your engineering or enablement team, which your processes, and then you got delivery folks, right? Which is your front line. You can probably you've probably organized in such a way that's not just a centralized TA team, but you've got a lot of flexibility
Yes.
in that you're now designed for lots of different ways forward.
Yes.
In terms of if execution is where there's going to be probably the most potential change or innovation, great, then that's where you're set up for that. Strategy can kind of understand that need and communicate it. Enablement can help deliver it. And then you're basically looking at, even though they're the largest volume of folks you have in the team, you're set up really well for all different scenarios that you need to go in, which is unique. I know a lot of folks are trying to bring the strategic part into the role of the recruiter. Like we talk about the strategy, the talent advisor 2.0, and how does she better run the strategy, understand the strategy. And often the cases we keep finding is that that person just doesn't have the capability here. Not every recruiter is ready to fully understand strategy. But if we can compartmentalize the core of strategy in one smaller group, and then help enable through a different team every recruiter with the bit that they need to
That's
understand,
right.
it works.
Yeah.
And it's unique. But Blair, this is probably not been easy. You describe it and it's so logical, makes so much sense to me. And you hinted at it earlier on. I know we're out of time. We wanted to talk about the frontline team, which we won't get to go into on this, but maybe would you mind sharing, before we go into what's next and close with that, would you mind just sharing maybe what's been hardest and perhaps been most surprising, or what have you learned about trying to implement this as a lesson for others who are going through change? What would be your biggest surprise, biggest learning you can share with others?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I will say is we knew this was going to be a big undertaking. And the one thing up front before we even started doing the work is we were transparent with our recruiting organization. We are
Mm,
going to do this work. We are going to understand where we have pain points. We want to build something that works, to help you, et cetera. We brought them along in the journey. That to me was lesson number one in doing something like this at scale that really helped us, because nothing was this huge surprise, because we were bringing people along in the journey in a way that we could. I think the other thing is, you are absolutely right. We tried to look at what are we building to be a future forward function that can be more predictive, give better experiences. And that's why we ended up making some of the choices that we made, because we knew we were going to need to have a place to be agile in the system. And so, yes, we didn't get to frontline examples or early talent, but we're initiating some of these similar types of thinking within big pieces of work within our group. Because when you start to look at the types of expectations within talent acquisition to become, run faster, run more efficient, et cetera, there are still elements that are very, very human in what we do. And I think that the way that we're thinking about using the people in our organization to partner with the appropriate tools and technology, but to bring those human moments when they really matter in things like a recruitment strategy meeting. So it might sound basic that you want to have a good intake, but we have put a lot of emphasis on training our recruiters to have a really strong recruitment strategy meeting, because if you get that part right, it enables so many other things through the system. You can, source better, you can use your tools better, you can have, so I think it's not forgetting how the partnership also of your tools, your technologies, and your people comes together. And so, just not building for what's right in front of us, but really thinking about what's happening, the disruptions, and leveraging your greatest asset, which is your people, in the right ways to make sure your processes and your experiences are really phenomenal. Because the market's competitive. I mean, talent, we are competing for the best of the best with many other companies, and so we want to be able to show up in a way that feels super good.
you're right. People can be found. Talent is more difficult. And you're right about the RSM as a force multiplier throughout the process. Get that right. And its impact on your other processes is just huge. Blair, in closing, what's next? What you mentioned that some of this stuff is still in progress, still going for, but what's next on your agenda as you approach that 7-year itch? What else do you think you can deliver? And is your team working on or thinking of working on as we head into, let's say, 2027?
Yeah, I will say I mentioned kind of this talent foresights bit that we added this year. I think this is super exciting because we're actually thinking very differently,
Mhm.
understanding that not only is, advanced technology, AI, all of this like changing the way that we work, but it's literally going to change our workforces. And so this is a group that we've stood up, and it's a small group, it's 3 people, but to look at like, how are these types of changes going to really impact the workforce, and in that way we're thinking about things to scenario model, right, and to really get into like breaking down your jobs to your skills to your tasks, and how might that be reconfigured or redesigned, and how might agents and people be working together, and what might those teams look like, and what's the cost of that, and how do you create different build buy borrow blend strategies. So this part gets me so excited because it's like totally new ways of thinking, and we're bringing this as a new capability in HR, and we're building it to be able to show the enterprise, how we might be able to look different and get ahead of things in the years to come.
What I really love is that you believe that should be something driven by TA. And that's phenomenal. I agree as well. I think it can be something driven by TA. Like other folks in HR could show up and begin to try and tackle those problems. And we can't tackle it by ourselves. It needs to be across the HR organization. But I love the fact that TA and PepsiCo is saying, hey, we want to jump in and try and fix these problems and go after these opportunities. By the way, on the innovation, just as a side note, it was in Chicago last week, Blair, and I came across PepsiCo with new probiotics. And I was like,
Yes, our
that is,
Pepsi
that is so
prebiotic.
cool. That's
It's
so cool.
very good.
Yeah, it's so
Yes.
cool. I was like, that is innovation. That's clever. I see that. It's evident now. Of course, PepsiCo is coming out with those products. When I hear what you're doing and the way you're thinking, it's a cultural thing, not just a product thing.
Yeah.
Blair, again, I could definitely go for the 2 hours in terms of questions. Love to have you back again, dig in some other issues. You've given us so much food for thought. I'll be sharing this particular episode with tons of people I know because I think you've given us an education in terms of future TA structure. And thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Johnny. And yes, the time went by so fast, and would love to keep talking at any point in time.
Well, thank you as well for listening. I hope you really enjoyed that. I know I certainly did. So much there from Blair. You'll probably want to reach out and rent Blair's brain for hours and her fantastic team. And Blair says it regularly. It's a team effort. She's got some wonderful people. Hiring the best talent for PepsiCo starts with hiring the best talent for TA. And Blair's done a wonderful job in doing that and building a great team. We're going to be back next week with another fantastic episode and the brilliant leaders sharing their story of hiring excellence with us. Until then, take care. Talk to you next week.